Hey everyone, I'm Alex from Cytonox, and today I'm going to be ranking the bosses of Persona 3 Reload from worst to best. The Persona series is one of my absolute favorites, so it came as no surprise to me that this game kicked ass. I'd only ever played a tiny bit of FES on an emulator before then, so it was my first true experience with Persona 3. The only rule here is that I will not be ranking Chidori or Elizabeth's boss fight, since one is a 3-turn scripted event and the other is a psychosis-inducing waste of time that's nearly impossible unless you spend 10 hours in the Velvet Room trying to fuse a full element resist Orpheus Telos. If you did it, I'm happy for you, but I'm just taking my platinum and bailing, personally. And of course, as always, thank you to our patrons who voted for this game to be covered in our poll way back when. The Persona fans among you all have them to thank for this particular production. Without further ado, let's get into the video. Number 11, Takaya. First off, yes, I know that's the Persona 5 font we use. Persona 3's font is just stupid blocks, so we at Cytonox took some artistic license here. It's strange to see arguably the main antagonist languishing here at the back end of the list, but it led to an interesting revelation on my part. In almost every case, the lamest fights in Persona games are the ones against actual people who also have personas. Other than the instance of this in Persona 4, it's an overwhelmingly disappointing roster of bums who fail to intimidate or challenge the player in any sense of the word. It's also just less cool for some reason. This is the part I have trouble understanding, since in most games the absolute coolest bosses are always this exact type of character, the rival with similar abilities. Dark Samus from Metroid Prime, Virgil from Devil May Cry, V2 from Ultra Kill, the list goes on. Persona is curiously exempt from this, I think primarily because these fights are always just sorta pathetic. They tend to come at the end of their respective games when you have access to enormously powerful abilities and party setups. Unless they pull out all the stops, which they seldom do, you're going to be running circles around them. I'll say now that no boss in this game is bad at all though, thank the heavens. The very worst the game has to offer is mid, which in my line of work is a blessing. The story is still solid. Takaya had been awfully chill with you over the course of the game, exchanging banter with Makoto every so often to try to convince you that obliterating humanity is actually chill and awesome. It naturally doesn't work out, because while Makoto may want to kill himself, roping everybody else into it is off the table. That, and nobody wants to hang out with a crackhead all the time. Takaya looks like the LMFAO guys somehow had a kid and gave it the Foxdie virus, inbreeding factor included. He'd certainly have an issue with no shoes, no shirt, no service. Strega is pretty much a junkie circus troupe, so it's a bit hard to take them seriously, especially considering all of them but Chidori look dumb. Number 10, Takaya and Jin. This fight, as it exists in my memory, is pretty much the same as the former on a functional level. They pose absolutely no threat to you. You could probably smoke these bozos on auto fight after setting up your initial buffs and debuffs. I gave them an edge over the solo Takaya fight because Jin is a much more interesting combatant given he can inflict status ailments. Despite playing second banana, he has a lot more goodies in his bag of tricks than the big guy. The irony of them jumping you to prevent you from killing the hanged man is great, because Lord knows that thing can do just fine on its own. They should have sat this one out and explored each other's bodies in the Love Hotel or whatever those guys do in their free time. As it is, they remain C's victims with no hope of victory. Number 9, Jin. I almost feel bad putting out this ranking because placing all 3 of the Strega bosses consecutively at the bottom feels like it's some kind of statement. They just so happen to feel the least unique to me from a gameplay point of view, and while they have more story going on than the Shadows, it's arguably less interesting despite that. I found Strega to be the least interesting part of the overall plotline in general, except for their role in Aragaki's arc. Jin's final fight is the best of them to me because he jacks himself with a fatal dose of Tren partway through, which both made it more memorable and gave him enough HP to survive a bit longer than he would have otherwise. His fighting style is largely the same from the last encounter, but it's evolved to a suitable enough degree that it doesn't feel hopelessly undertuned for endgame. Number 8, the Empress and the Emperor. At last we arrive at the actual legitimate bosses, although it's still a stretch to bestow that honor unto our first major arcana boss of the video. Despite capping off a full moon, it feels very mini-boss-ish due to how gimmicky it is compared to the others. While I think it's good to give RPG bosses at least one major gimmick to make them stand out and break your usual combat loop, as you'll see later, this one is very simplistic when you get it down. It's essentially a tutorial for Fuka's ability, with the bosses constantly changing affinities, forcing you to sniff out their weakness with her persona. Once this clicks for you, the threat level plummets to virtually nil. I can maybe see digging this if you're a certified Fuka freak like Lotus Juice and a certain Bostonian I know, but for all of us normal people who think she's a boring piece of cardboard, it has the emotional impact of a physics seminar. Don't even get me started on ranking the characters, by the way. My tier list would make all of you go blind. If there's one positive about the Empress and Emperor duo, it's that they have pretty unique designs. That could be said of all the Arcana bosses though, so it's really more a credit to Persona 3's excellent art design than any specific boss. Number 7, the Hierophant and the Lovers. I mostly remember these guys for trying to brainwash Yukari into having sex with you as a distraction. I wouldn't object, seeing as Yukari is my favorite pick romantically speaking, although that's a whole wasp nest of a discussion right there. If you want my quick 2 cents, I feel like Yukari is the best choice practically speaking, but I guess literally existing to love you makes it kinda messed up to reject her, so it's a bit of a pickle. I feel like you kinda gotta go Aigis, considering Yukari could in theory get over rejection despite the answers strongly suggesting otherwise, whereas Aigis would literally just have nothing to do. That's a pretty brutal existence to bestow upon someone if you ask me. The only argument I ever see against Aigis is that you can't bang her because she's a robot, but I feel like that's being willfully obtuse. Necessity is the mother of invention, and humanity is, generally speaking, pretty good at finding workarounds to such obstacles. You could definitely get some sort of system going that doesn't result in your Johnson getting hydraulic pressed into chewing gum. She lets you permanently sear your genetic data into her processing core, which is like the most romantic gesture ever. But I digress. Regardless of anybody's personal opinion on which fictional high schooler they want to make out with the most, you cannot in fact do that here because it would mean abandoning your mission to save all of humanity like a jackass. The first boss fight in this duo was the Hierophant, who is basically just a fake-out boss to make you wonder where the other shadow is. It doesn't die instantly or anything, but it's got nothing particularly memorable in its arsenal. All it does of note is inflicting fear and doing sizable AoE damage, which are both easily dealt with as long as Yukari is in your party. You'll eventually whittle him down with physical attacks and theurgies without much in the way of notable obstacles. The Lovers is a bit more interesting, since it can inflict Charm, which is a way more disruptive status effect than Fear. It's still rather gimmickless compared to the other bosses, but I cut it some slack since it's one of the earliest fights in the game and has a cool segment dedicated to it. Number 6, Fortune and Strength. Finally, we get into the meat of the real bosses, starting out with this odd coupling here. The idea with these two is that Fortune, which is the flat sphinx-looking one for the unfamiliar, is invisible for the first phase, so it works more like an environmental hazard than a traditional boss. Strength doesn't have anything too special going on in isolation, but it doesn't really matter because you'll have your hands full enough with Fortune going around anyways. The effects on Fortune's roulette wheel are cool because it's not just a bunch of debuffs or flat damage penalties of varying severity like one might expect. It truly is random in the most earnest sense, with effects equally likely to both help and hinder you spotting the wheel. As a long-suffering gambling addict of the Dokkan Battle variety, I'm no stranger to trying my luck, as seen with my descent into poverty trying to pull 9th Anniversary Broly. But this is something you don't see too often, and getting a favorable result hits on the same nerve that the Mario and Luigi RPGs ingeniously discovered, which is the satisfaction of making the enemy turn become interesting by making it potentially work to your benefit. The way I see it, there are 2 main ways enemy turns can be made engaging in a turn-based combat system. Either make the difficulty bullshit levels of hard so that you spend every turn clenching your jaw praying for dodge procs like SMT3, or make it so that things that benefit you can happen on the enemy turn. Watching the wheel spin is a combination of both, and that it makes you anticipate the result and potentially get hyped if it triggers an area-wide Tarukaja or something. There's also that ominous-ass skull spot on the wheel, which on a first playthrough is terrifying because you spend the whole fight paranoid that you might get bad RNG and have your whole party get insta-killed. It does have a scripted turn of that actually happening, but curiously it does nothing. Wow, lucky me! Fortune and Strength aren't what I'd call a true test of your abilities, but they're a fittingly balanced mid-game boss with a cool mechanic that elevates it beyond the less involved fights below. Number 5, the Hermit. This is an interesting boss in that it's one of the only ones with a central elemental affinity, in this case lightning. One look at my party here should have everyone who's played the game face-palming and shaking their head, but in case you're one of those folks who refuses to play the game for some reason and exclusively watches videos on it, half of my lineup is weak to lightning. It's not like I couldn't have foretold this either. The segment preceding it makes it pretty obvious that it's going to be an electric-themed boss. For some reason I was dogmatically devoted towards keeping the exact same party lineup for 90% of the game, so Yukari and Aigis were getting absolutely tortured in my gameplay. Anyways, the other major aspect of this fight is that it has DPS tests every so often where the Hermit will begin charging a super move that you need to prevent by beating up on its wires. I always love the feeling of canceling a move by staggering someone out of it, so it's a winner of a mechanic in my book. That said, I feel like you have to really suck at the game to mess this up. I literally broke its charge with 2 attacks, which is rather sad. It must be designed to bait people into getting spooked and guarding their turn away, because I can't think of any other way someone could fail this. It's still a legitimate fight overall, hence why I have it fairly high up, but it probably plays out a little better on higher difficulties. Number 4, Justice and the Chariot. Here's our first tough cookie of the list. Justice and the Chariot can fuse into a single being with an insane elemental resistance chart, so making headway takes a decent while. It's correspondingly weak offensively, but if you don't progress quickly enough, you're going to start running out of SP, which gets nasty quick. It has a very chivalrous tendency to tell you ahead of time who it's targeting, so that removes a bit of the luck from your end. Once you break them apart, the game decides to troll you by strongly implying you should solo target Justice, and then having the Chariot promptly revive it to half health should you do so. It's such an obvious middle finger that it didn't even piss me off because I just imagined everybody at Atlas HQ laughing in a room together while designing it this way. It's nothing you shouldn't expect given what a staple this type of boss is in the world of RPGs. The temporarily combined health bars that you separate with Theurgies is a cool iteration on the norm though, since it allows you to whittle them down together for a time, which acts as a safeguard against the fight dragging out past its welcome, even if you fall for the trick as a new player. This is definitely a fight that I had to piece out a little bit in my head as I fought it, which is a welcome feeling once you're this far into the game. Number 3, the Priestess. Seeing the very first boss in the game crack the top 3 of an RPG is insanely rare, but I found this fight to be such a great introduction that it ended up staying in my memory long after taking it down. The first thing I noticed was the music, which besides being awesome, happened to fit the situation especially well. The setting of a speeding bullet train with a collision point up ahead is classic action fare, but it really does spice up a turn-based battle when you have a time limit forcing you to act quicker than you otherwise might. It's extremely unlikely to be a genuine threat given how generous they were with the timer, but even the fact that a deadline exists at all charges the encounter with an air of intensity that you don't get easily. The speed up move at the end is genuinely stressful too, although I think they could have had it cut even closer to get you really sweating. Being able to see the background moving while you fight in a game like this is rare as well, so I was just really high on the sense of dynamism from the get-go. It helps too that the Priestess is mechanically sound, far more so than the Emperor and Empress that succeeded a month later. I distinctly remember beating this boss and thinking that Persona 3 seems to have the best bosses in the series, definitely better than 4s and probably 5s if we're being honest. For making a great first impression, I think the Priestess deserves the honor of the bronze medal here. Number 2, the Hanged Man. Here we are at long last. Big Daddy. As the uncontested hardest boss in the game, if nothing else, you gotta pay respects to the final shadow. You never know quite what you're gonna get each month, but I can't say I expected Jesus Christ on a stick getting airdropped in Kong style. For the first part of the fight, he's suspended in what looks to be an extraordinarily painful mid-air plank, which unbeknownst to Seize is something they'll get to experience within the hour thanks to Ikutsuki, who, for the record, has to be the most random, unforeseeable twist villain ever. They barely even explain this guy's motive or mention him later in the game. He just suddenly outs himself as a complete nutcase and then gets shot. Bravo. Nice work, dude. But that's getting off topic. The Hanged Man needs to be brought down to earth by killing his supply of evil sentient Virgin Mary statues, which is a task that gets progressively more difficult as the fight goes on, due to their changing affinities and access to high-level almighty magic. I never died here, but I came damn close a number of times, which didn't tend to happen much outside of random mini-bosses in Tartarus that were inexplicably way harder than the Arcana shadows. Even once you finally get a chance to bust up the Hanged Man, he starts coking himself out with crit buffs and extra actions, which can easily jam a monkey wrench into things if you haven't been keeping evasion buffs up on your party. This is a genuine, bona fide battle for your life, and it feels good to be able to go all out against something and not have it crumple before you've dug deep enough into your reserves. I imagine it's even harder in the original game without Theurgies, so that must really be something. Hats off to the giant naked guy in the sky. Number 1, Nyx Avatar. I simply can't imagine having any other boss at the top. Nyx transcends any possible pros or cons on the gameplay front by serving as the emotional climax of all that the game has been building up to since the very first day. It's a duel with the very concept of death itself, or more accurately the human will to death that compels its arrival. This is the only god boss in Persona as a whole that was actually interesting and representative of a genuine dilemma or struggle that wasn't blindingly obvious. I'm not saying the average Joe Schmo is out there walking around seriously contemplating checking into hell prematurely, but the game really hammers home a feeling of monotony and hopelessness, especially in the final few months, that makes you wonder why the hell you even bother to get up in the morning. Sometimes you really do just want to sit in bed and mindlessly decay into nothingness, apathy syndrome style. It happens. I've been scheduling this international public relations conference thing the past few weeks, and that stuff has been giving me constant migraines like you wouldn't believe. It's all just so very exhausting. And yet, Persona 3 is equally forceful about encouraging you to find the will to persist and function at your highest level despite knowing someday you'll be dust, in some ways especially for that reason. Rejecting the lunar will to death and embracing the solar will to life is badass and what this fight is all about. As far as the gameplay goes, it's weirdly easy to the point that I expected another phase and was disappointed when it was just over. But it has an incredible amount of phase changes, provided you count each arcana as a phase, and cycling through them all is a great way to structure the fight. Just a bit funny that it lets you use Armageddon on the final boss and end it instantly. The music is absolutely incredible too. The battle for everyone's souls is a perfect backing for the fight. Finally, being on top of Tartarus is awesome too, considering you've been climbing the thing for literal months. The last stretch up on the moon has the usual routine where everybody you ever met sends you energy for a spirit bomb, but it's less stupid than Persona 4's, which is really all I asked. I just ignore that disgusting piglet slime and pretend like he's not even there. At least my favorite television conman made it. There's a lot more I could say about this fight since it's so intertwined with the ending, but it's really not necessary if you've experienced it yourself. You know. I'll end it off on the most important words of all. The Arcana is the means by which all is revealed. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. That concludes my coverage of Persona 3, 4, and 5, meaning I've now done the entire series. Jokes aside, I've actually played the PSP port of Persona 1, making me the first person to ever do so. Very honored to have this distinction. It's honestly, not fun at all, but it's one of those things like reading War and Peace where if you tell people you did it, they're just impressed and won't really quiz you because they haven't done it either. Anyways, as always, make sure to like and subscribe, and consider joining our Patreon if you want to call the shots on future videos as well as watch them a week early. That's all for now. Deuces.